Okay, hello again, everyone. Welcome to this training on using career and technical education data to identify equity gaps in Oregon. I'm Elabelle Ajamor. My colleague, Michelle Hodera, and I co-lead the Oregon Graduation and Postsecondary Success Research Practice Partnership that we call GPS because it's too big a mouthful. Through GPS, we try to help you educators in making use of data and evidence to support your work. I've been working in Oregon for 8 years. I do a lot of trainings on data and evidence use and progress monitoring for programs. And I started here as the research director for the Oregon Leadership Network that some of you may have been familiar with. It was a statewide network of education leaders that was focused on improving equitable outcomes for our students. And it's great to see so many regions represented this morning. Okay, process for a second. As questions come up, please ask them in the chat. We'll monitor and we'll respond as we go along, and then we'll also stop periodically to see if there are any questions, and then you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our plan for today. First, we're going to clarify our objectives and provide some context regarding equity and the study that informs this training series. Second, we'll present the data inquiry framework and the data dashboard that we're going to use to examine state and local equity gaps, and there'll be an opportunity for individual exploration in breakouts. Third, we'll demonstrate conducting a root cause analysis using gender gaps as an example. And finally, you'll have an opportunity to continue with individual exploration with facilitators available to answer questions. Next slide, please. Okay, before we dive into the content, note that we're able to provide this training through funding from the Regional Educational Laboratory Northwest, or REL Northwest. The U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences selects organizations to operate 10 RELs across the United States through a competitive bidding process. Each REL serves their respective geographic regions, and the states that we serve here in the Northwest are highlighted on the map. The goal of the REL program, like the goal of GPS, is to help states and districts use data to address important policy issues and improve educational practices. Through GPS, we've been doing work in Oregon for over 4 years related to college and career readiness and the transition from secondary to post-secondary education. Next slide, please. Okay, why are we here today? This is the first of a series of 3 trainings on using CTE participation data. The main goal for today is to provide you with data on CTE participation and retention, as well as guidance on interpreting the data. And to meet this goal, we will familiarize you with the data in the dashboard, and these data should help you and your team identify potential equity gaps in CTE participation and/or retention. Finally, a gap or area of need that you identify based on these data will become the topic of a root cause analysis, and we'll train you on that process as well. In the second training, you will conduct the root cause analysis, and we will present evidence-based strategies for closing equity gaps in CTE, and you can select from those based on your own root cause analyses. The data dashboard that you will use allows for investigating equity gaps by gender, economic disadvantage, special education status, and English learner status. The strategies that we'll cover in the second training will be focused on these groups of students. And finally, the third training will focus on preparing an operational plan for addressing CTE equity gaps, including how these can be incorporated into your next comprehensive local needs assessment, the CLNA, and how you can measure progress. Next slide, please. Since we're focusing on equity gaps, it's important to remember the context that we're working in. Oregon's education leaders adopted an equity lens in 2011 and called for explicitly identifying disparities in education outcomes for the purpose of targeting areas for action, intervention, and investment. The equity lens emphasizes racial equity with a particular focus on underserved students such as out-of-school youth, English learners, and students in some communities of color and some rural geographical locations. The equity lens has been used in making decisions about resource investments in the state, and means that when evaluating state programs, we need to consider whether the program is providing equitable access and moving the needle towards equity for outcomes that the program is theorized to impact. We understand that you may have your own organization's equity lens, and so please keep that in mind as well as we go through this training. And now I'll pass it on to Amy to introduce herself and give you an overview of the REL Northwest study of CTE in Oregon, from which the data that we're recording with today come from. Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Arneson. I was the principal investigator of the REL Northwest study of CTE in Oregon, which was released last summer that we'll refer to today. Along with my colleagues who are also on the call, Michelle Hodara and Steve Klein. I'm a senior researcher in quantitative methods at Education Northwest, and a huge chunk of my work right now is researching how CTE happens in schools, who is participating and persisting in programs, and finally kind of evaluating the impact of CTE programming on student outcomes. And so we're looking at kind of that second bucket that I mentioned today, who is participating and persisting in programs. So the study that we're referring to today, REL Northwest conducted the study in collaboration with the Oregon Department of Education and the Higher Education Coordinating Commission to provide information about the changing secondary CTE landscape in Oregon. This is the first study to examine secondary CTE school offerings and student participation and outcomes in Oregon under the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act of 2006. We usually just call that Perkins IV. Results presented in this study are from data collected during the state's implementation of Perkins IV. So we use data dating back to 2007-08 through 2017-18. Oregon has developed a new state plan, state CTE plan under Perkins V, which is the reauthorization of the Perkins IV legislation. And implementation is beginning this year of that Perkins V state plan. So in this time of kind of transition to the new state plan, summarizing the CTE landscape under Perkins IV provides baseline information to guide implementation for providers now under Perkins V. So in this study, we looked at CTE participation in high school for the cohort that started high school in 07-08, which was the earliest year of data we had. So that's the class of 2011. So that's the first kind of time point that you see on this plot all the way on the left side there. And we went to the latest graduating cohort available in the data at the time, which was the class of 2018. We did add one more cohort to this analysis for the data dashboard. So you all will see your own data through the class of 2019 today. And so in the study and on the dashboard, we classified students into 4 CTE participation groups. The first is non-participants. So those are students who did not take any CTE, who earned fewer than half a credit. So who took if they took any CTE, they didn't earn the credit, or they took not a half a year course, if you have quarter credits available in your programs or something like that. But the vast majority of those are students with no CTE credits. Participants are secondary students who earn at least a half a credit. So they took at least 1 half-year course in a CTE program of study. Concentrators, as defined in the report and as defined under the Perkins IV state plan, are participants who earned at least 1 full credit. So took 1 full year of CTE coursework in a single program of study. And then this last group that we termed concentrators plus in the report, and that's the same language that we use on the dashboard, just as a way to differentiate them from who we were calling concentrators, is the new definition of concentrators under Perkins V. We'll call them concentrators plus for today so that they're a little bit different. But those are students who earned at least 2 credits. So now we're looking at students who kind of have sustained 2 full years of CTE coursework in a single program. It is important to understand that these groups are defined cumulatively. So any student that we call a concentrator is also a participant because they met that threshold, they exceeded the threshold. Any student we call a concentrator plus is also a participant and a concentrator as well. This will be important kind of in your understanding of how we break down some of the data in the graphs on the dashboard later. So just they are overlapping categories, so just note that. In the study, we found gaps in participation, concentration plus, and program retention rates. We found gaps by gender, race, ethnicity, special education status, English learner status, and socioeconomic status statewide. The gaps were especially pronounced in some career areas. For example, programs in industrial and engineering sciences had much higher participation and retention rates for male students than for female students, while we saw the opposite programs in health sciences. So those are some of the specifics you'll be able to explore on the dashboard. It's not shown on this slide right now, but you'll be able to break it down in that way and explore. So in this training, you'll be provided with these data for your own district or region. And I am going to pass it back to Ella to give an overview of kind of the data inquiry framework that we'll be using in these trainings.
Thanks, Amy. So what is a data inquiry framework? It's a cyclical approach to using data to develop and answer questions to address problems of practice. It's a process to support data-informed conversation and action in education. It has been shown to help teams of educators focus on concrete issues over time and to support school improvement. Today, we are focusing on the first few steps. I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So seeking information, which is the step where we formulate questions, and access and gather data, which is the step where we will use the dashboard. And then there's analyze and interpret the data, which will lead us to identifying equity gaps and running a root cause analysis. Next slide, please. So today we'll demonstrate a root cause analysis, and then you'll continue within this step in the second training by performing your own. The third training will be focused, as I said earlier, on creative operational plans based on what you uncovered in the data analysis and root cause analysis. And that'll include identifying metrics to measure progress. And measuring progress is the last step before you go through the cycle again. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so where do we begin? The first step of the data inquiry process is to seek information or to ask questions. In this training, we have two questions that we're going to answer. What are the CTE participation and retention rates of various groups of students in Oregon and in your district or region? And how are differences in participation and retention rates related to student characteristics? The cycle and the materials and processes that we're training you on can be applied to other questions that you have about CTE and CTE students, and frankly, to any data that you might be interested in looking at. And we're going to use the data dashboard to answer these questions. And so I'll pass it back on to Amy, who's going to orient you to the dashboard. Next slide, please.
Great. So now we are going to walk you through how to access and gather your data using the dashboard, which is step 2 of the framework. I will navigate. I'll bring up the actual dashboard on my screen here in just a few slides, but I just want to orient you to a few things on it first. So, and some of you may have started exploring it already. But there are going to be 3 tabs at the top of the dashboard that have 3 different kind of types and looks of analyses on the participation data. The first tab we call the annual participation tab. This provides kind of snapshots of CTE program participation categories at that point in time. So you're going to choose a school year. So in that school year, it'll summarize CTE program participation over all high school students. So that's important to note that tab includes all students in grades 9 through 12. For those students, it shows the highest participation category overall and for student groups. So you can break it down by different student groups. At the highest participation category that they attained by the end of that school year. So in that tab, you will have ninth graders who maybe haven't entered CTE yet. And so they might show up as a non-participant at that time. It doesn't mean they never, later in time, they may have attained participant or concentrator status, but they wouldn't show up as that until you select that year and look at the year that they started earning credits. The cohort participation tab is going to show similar things in terms of, we're going to show you participation and retention rates. But instead, the group that we're looking at changes a little bit. So there we're going to be looking at a graduation cohort. And we'll look at, for a class, for the class of 2019, we'll be looking back at their entire high school career and summarizing their CTE participation over those 3 or 4 or 5 years, however long they were in high school. So it's just a slightly different view of CTE. Annual participation is just kind of a slice in time. This is what it looks like for all high school students, whereas the cohort participation tab, again, we're looking back at it at a student's entire high school career. The third tab, the equity exploration tab, provides a lot of the same information that the cohort participation tab provides. So again, we're again going to be looking at those cohorts, and it actually is the exact same information, but it's just organized into data displays and plots and graphs that are designed to easily spot equity gaps. So it's just a different way of looking at some of the same data, kind of with an eye on equity. On each of those tabs, you're going to have some drop-down menus where you're going to make decisions about what data you want to explore. So there's going to be kind of 3 or 4 decisions to make on each tab, how you want to filter the data, basically. So you can filter your data by school year. And so we have 4 years of data available to you on the dashboard. On the cohort and equity exploration tabs, you can actually combine across those 4 years if you want to just look at all of it together. You'll also select what we're calling your entity. Okay, so I'm going to stay at the state level when I run the demo here. We'll look at state level data, but you'll be able to choose whether you want to look at district level data or region. And we use kind of the CTE consortium to define region here. So you'll select kind of which type of entity you want to look at, and then the second drop-down menu, you'll actually select your district or your region. You'll then choose the student groups that you want to compare. So we can compare by these different groups. This might be a little small for you to see, but once you're into the data dashboard, you'll be able to see this list. But we can look at comparisons by ELL status. So that's English language learners. We can look at comparisons by free and reduced price lunch status, FRPL or FERPL. And so that's kind of used as a proxy for socioeconomic disadvantage. Gender, we can compare by gender. On the combined years where we are looking at multiple grades, you can also compare by grade level. By IEP status, so individualized education plan or special education, students receiving special education services and those who are not. And then we also have some ways that you can look at race ethnicity categories as well. And then finally, on the first 2 tabs, you'll be able to select if you want to look at a specific career learning area. So you can look at everybody combined. That's just kind of the default view when you click into the dashboard for the first time. But if you want to break it down and only look at business and management, you can do that. On the third tab, the way that we have the graphs is you'll see all of them already. So you're not going to pick one because you're going to be looking at all of them at the same time. You can also break it down that way. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the dashboard. So I just have to take a minute and rearrange my screen a little bit. Jenny can drop the link in the chat to the dashboard if you need it. The link was also distributed in the reminder email, and it's also on your note-taking sheet if you do have your note-taking sheet open on your computer. This link will be active, so you can access it after the training as well. I'm going to walk through activity 1 using state level data on the note-taking sheet. So I'll start with activity 1. We'll walk through 3 of them together here. In the breakout session, you're going to be filling out the note-taking sheet with your own data. So don't fill out the sheet with exactly what I show now. So I'm just giving you a demo. You want to leave it blank so that you can fill it in with your own data once we move into the breakouts. All righty, so that seemed really easy. I hope everyone's seeing what they should be seeing, which is kind of a split screen here. On the left half of my screen, I have the dashboard open. On the right half of my screen, I have the note-taking sheet open. So this should, okay, and then that's great. So sometimes if you let the dashboard sit a little bit too long, it wants to kind of like refresh. So I think that's what just happened there. So in activity 1, we want to look at this annual participation data. So as a reminder, this is slice in time, snapshot, grades 9 through 12. What's kind of the level of participation of all of those students, grades 9 through 12. In 2018-19, so we're going to stay with just the most current year that we have. Once you're in there, you'll pick your own entity type and entity that you want to look at. I'll stay at the state level for now. In the demo, we're going to compare by gender, but once we get through these 3 activities and kind of you're on your own with the dashboard, you can compare other groups. And then just to start also, we'll just stick with all areas combined. So on your note-taking sheet, moving down to this table, I'm just going to kind of walk through cell by cell and kind of turn these cells on as we go through it. But we want to think about what are our total participation, concentration, and concentration plus rates for the year that we selected, which is 18-19, which is statewide. So that's what we're seeing here. So if I want the total participation rate, so this is where how we defined them comes into play, because all concentrators are also participants and concentrators plus. So if I want the total CTE participant rate, in the way that this data display is set up, I have to add these 3 sections together. They're all participants here. We've separated them out into kind of these categories because that is one other way to slice the data, and you might find some interesting things there. But if I want the total participation rate statewide, all students, it's going to be this 13% plus 26 plus 24. So I'm going to add all 3 of those together. Is this highlighting? It is. I just can't see it. Okay. So a 63% total participation rate there. And then if I want to compare the total participation rate for male and female students, I have to add those 3 bars together for each of those groups as well. So for female students, I'm looking at 11, 23, and 25%. So adding them together, total participation rate of 59. And then for male students, the 3 chunks there, 15% plus 28% plus 23, 66%. So we are seeing, looking at the data this way, that we have a higher participation rate for male students than female students. If I want the total concentrator rate, so that's my my orange chunk, which is the concentrators who didn't quite reach plus. So those are students who earned at least a credit, but didn't hit 2 credits quite yet. So generally students with 1 or 1.5 credits. So I'm going to have to add those also to my concentrators plus, who also earned at least 1 credit. They exceeded that. They earned at least 2 credits. So my total concentrator rate is 13 plus 26, 39%. And then for the genders, I'm going to add those as well. So my female student concentrator rate is 34%. And my male student rate, or I'm sorry, my male concentrator rate is 43%. And then the concentrator plus rate is just that purple chunk of the bars. So we don't have to do any adding there. So those are just going to come straight from the numbers that you see there. 13 overall, 11% for female students, and 15% for male students. And then we're also going to ask you in this activity to pick a learning area that's of interest to you. And so coming back up to kind of these filters at the top, I'm going to choose health sciences. So if I want to look at health sciences, what are my different participation and concentration rates? And then by gender, choosing that, the data display should update right away, or within a few seconds after you choose that. We are seeing that overall the bar is shorter, but we are breaking it down now to just that one learning area. So now the question is, what's the participation rate? What's the health sciences participation rate for all of the students, grades 9 through 12, enrolled in 2018-19? So to get that for all students, I'm going to, again, add these three chunks together. Sometimes if you get a small slice, the percentage isn't going to be displayed right there for you, just so it doesn't look cluttered. But if you hover over any of the data points on any of these graphs, you get this little tooltip that'll give you that information. So now I can see if I hover over that purple slice is 2%, is rounded to 2%. So my total participation rate is going to be 2 plus 2 plus 3. So these are smaller numbers, a little bit easier to add. So 7% altogether. So for all of the students enrolled in high school, 18-19, 7% of them were health sciences participants. And then if I want to break it down by gender, female students had a 9% participation rate. And then male students, I do have to hover over again, but the little tiny slice is 1%, the orange slice is 1%, and then 2% on the green slice, so 4% altogether. The total concentrator rate, now I'm just adding the purple and the orange. So my concentrators plus, and then the other concentrators who weren't concentrators plus. So that's a 4% rate overall, 2 plus 2. And then for the male and female bars, adding just those first two together, 6% total for female students and 2% total for male students. And then my concentrator plus rate is just that purple on its own. Okay. So in your breakout groups, you'll have a few minutes to kind of work through your data on your own. And then we also will have some kind of guiding and discussion questions that you can, answer and discuss with your facilitator and the other people in your group. Also on the note-taking sheet, we have reminders of what the different participation categories are. And then we also gave you the details on how we defined all of our different student groups. So if you have questions about that, you can refer to your note-taking sheet. Further questions, you can always ask a facilitator as well. All right, and then moving on to activity 2. So activity 2, we're looking at the cohort participation tab. So I just clicked over there. And you'll see that most of my selections that I made on the last tab do carry over. That will happen in most cases. Sometimes if there's like something slightly different, it might not. So always double check and make sure that what you want to be looking at is still selected in your filters. But since I was still in health sciences, that's where I am here. So on this one, if we want to kind of explore this data, I'm just going to stay in 18-19. I'm going to stay at the state level, but again, you'll choose your own region here if you need to. We'll stick with gender. And then I do just need to click back into all areas combined so that we look at everything. So now these again are participation, concentration, and concentrator plus rates. But remember, this tab is for graduating cohorts. So the numbers are not going to match exactly what we just saw because now I'm only looking at students who graduated in 2018-19. And then I'm looking back at all of their years of high school and figuring out how many CTE credits they had in different programs. We also displayed the data just a little bit different here as well. So on that first tab, they were kind of broken down into those kind of stacked bar plots, kind of separating into 3 separate groups. Here we displayed the overlapping definition. So here there's not going to be any adding to do. So participation rate is given to you straight up. So it's the gray bar that's going to give you your total participation rate. And so this one might be a little bit quicker to fill out because again, you're just pulling the numbers just straight from there. So my participation rate for all students who graduated in 2018-19 is 77%. And then if I want to think about what that looks like for the male and female students, my participation rate for, the participation rate for female students was 73%, and for male students was 81%. And then same thing for concentrator. So concentrator is this pinkish magenta bar. 58% of all of those graduates were concentrators. So they earned at least a credit over their high school career in some CTE program. 52% for female students, 65% for male students. And then the concentrator plus rate is the purple section. So 28% overall, 24% for female students, and then 33% for male students. And then same idea here, we can break it down. We can look at just at health sciences. So the bars get shorter because we're just looking at one of those career areas. And it's the same idea here is that my participant rate is just going to be the height of each gray bar. So we see in health sciences, our female student participation rate is at 16%. Male students is half of that, is at 8%. Concentrator rates also higher for female students, and then concentrator plus rates also higher for female students. So there's that. So we did display this a little bit differently just because we do want to start thinking about what is kind of the drop off, or the other way, if we want to talk about it more in a more positive way, what's the retention or persistence rate, right? So how many students are entering into a CTE program, getting that half credit, and then moving on to take another half credit course, right? So moving from that half credit participant to that 1 credit concentrator. And so that's what's given in this table down here are those retention rates. So here the denominator of these rates is the number of participants. So we see that in health sciences, for students who graduated in 2018-19, 72% of health science participants also moved on to be health science concentrators. We have the same rate for concentrator plus. So how many of those participants were retained to earn at least 2 credits? So we see that 36% of those health science participants did that. So those are kind of the retention rates there. Okay. All right. And just like before, there will be some guiding questions that we can discuss in our breakout groups. Some definitions. So student group definitions just get a little bit different just because, again, we're looking at graduates instead of just any student enrolled in that year. And then finally, activity 3, the equity exploration tab. So what we have here, there's 3 plots. You see they're kind of, we call them like dumbbell or barbell plots, just because there's a bar with 2 dots at the end. There's 3 of those. This actually plots the exact same numbers that we just saw. Okay, so we just saw that the total participation rate for female students was 73%. So if you hover over this, you should see the exact same number there. It's also 73% here. It's 81% for male students. But what's different about this tab is just we've organized it in a way so that gaps are highlighted. We can see what that is just right away instead of having to kind of like look at 2 different plots and subtract numbers. We did that for you here. So we would say then that there's an 8 percentage point participation rate gap between male and female students here because the participation rate was 8% higher for male students. There's no learning area to choose here because just by default, we're just showing you all 6 of them again, so we can compare and see kind of what's driving gaps or what direction they go in. So we see when we break this down, the first question in the table on the note-taking sheet here is which learning areas are female students more likely to participate? So in this top graph, we're just looking for which learning areas is that blue dot. So my female students are shown in blue. Where's the blue dot higher than the red dot? Okay, so we see that that's the case in health sciences and human resources. And to help you out there, that's what we labeled on each of these. So we labeled the group with the higher rate. And then also gave you the size of the gap as well. So we see in health sciences, the size of that gap is also 8 percentage points. But just like anywhere else, you can always hover over. So if you hover over the dots, it'll give you the participation rate for that group. If you hover over the gap, the gray bar between them, it also gives you that size as well. So we see that, yeah, so female students are participating in health sciences and human resources at a higher rate than male students. And so same question, but for the male students is the 4 other areas. Now, these bottom 2 plots have to do with that retention rate. So those were the rates in the tables below the graph on the last slide, or on the last tab. And so here we want to think about, in which learning areas are female participants more likely to achieve concentrator status, or to be retained to concentrator status, or to persist to concentrator status, however you want to, whatever vocabulary you want to use to kind of describe that. And so again, we're looking for, where is the female, the blue dot, higher than the red dot? We see it's in the same 2 areas, in health sciences and human resources. And so in a way, this gap is kind of being compounded, because female students are, 1, already participating at higher rates, and then once they're in there, they're persisting at higher rates. So relatively, male students are not persisting, or are dropping out of these programs at a higher rate than female students. And so then again, here it's the same 4 categories. So that male students, or I'm sorry, 4 learning areas that male students are higher in. And then this last one, the purple, is now retention to concentrator plus. Okay, so the pink, again, retention to concentrator, that's getting to 1 credit. Participant enters, earns a half a credit, eventually earns a full credit. This one is 2 credits. So participants who came in, they earned a half a credit. That means they're in my denominator. Now, how many of them relatively earned 2 credits? And so we're seeing the same pattern here again, is that these retention rates are higher for female students in health sciences and human resources, and for male students in the other 4. Okay. So that brings us to, sorry, let me just get my PowerPoint back up here. So that brings us to have identified a statewide gap, right? So there are clear gender gaps in both CTE program participation and retention statewide, in a few different ways that we looked at the data. And so after the breakout session, which we'll hear in just a moment, we will demonstrate a root cause analysis to help us kind of unpack those gaps. So I do want to pause, and since I am sharing my screen, are there any questions before we move into, did anything come up in the chat?
I think we've taken all the questions in the chat, Amy.
Okay.
So if anybody wants to raise their hand, if they have a question that they'd like to ask live.
In your breakout rooms, which will not be recorded. So we are recording the main session, but the breakout sessions will not be recorded. You'll have just a smaller group, and then there's 4 facilitators here. One of us will be in your room as well. So if you have specific questions about the dashboard or your data and things like that, we can address it there. Okay, so all right, so we scheduled the breakout sessions for 30 minutes, and I think we're pretty much right on time. Well, we're a minute over. So we'll come back at 10:10. And as I said, facilitators will be in your breakout rooms. You can use this time to familiarize yourself with the database, complete the note-taking sheet, have some short discussions with individuals in your breakout room, and then also to take a short break before we come back at 10:10. But we will all reconvene back here in the main room at 10:10. I think we should all be back. Okay. So I hope that you all had a chance to, explore, dig into your data a little bit, at least start. I know it wasn't a ton of time, but at least start some discussions with others around the state and your colleagues. So what we're going to do with the remainder of the time till 10:30 is kind of look through what the next step of this is going to look like, which is a root cause analysis. So I'll go ahead and pass it to Steve to talk through some of that.
Great. Well, thanks, Amy. And hello, everyone. I'm Steve Klein. I direct our career education workforce development activities at Education Northwest. And now that we've had a chance to dig into some of the data and look at the equity gaps, we're going to go a little deeper in terms of demonstrating what's called a root cause analysis. I want to underscore something. We're not doing this, we're demonstrating it. The goal will be for you to begin to think about this during the time we have between the next training, and then at the next training, really dig into that. So in terms of the root cause analysis, definitionally, a root cause analysis has, you can advance that to the, there we go. It's a strategy that's used to identify and analyze component factors that can contribute to an education problem or some sort of observed outcome. Because education systems are complex, there's rarely a single root cause. So usually several causes in combination bring about an outcome. However, if we can focus on the root cause or primary root causes, we're going to be more likely to bring about improvements in outcomes. We want to go deep on this, meaning that root causes are not typically the most obvious. So you have to really be thoughtful as you approach the analysis. And we want to resolve it. Once we've resolved it, a symptom should disappear. For example, if your school district had low numbers of students earning an industry-recognized skill credential, one thing you could do would be to introduce a new short-term credential to increase your attainment rates. That could actually boost your outcomes, but it's not going to address the underlying cause of why few students are earning credentials in your existing programming. So with respect to the guidelines, one thing to do is focus on activities that are within your control. A helpful guide rail is to ask yourself, if the action that you take would directly influence and address the underlying cause, that's a good thing. If the factors are beyond your sphere of influence, refocus your efforts. You're not going to be able to make changes. Your team should also determine if an underlying root cause is the issue or it's what we would call a contributing factor. A contributing factor are conditions that collectively can increase the probability of an outcome that's problematic, but do not by themselves cause the problem. And one check to determine whether you've got your root cause nailed down is determine whether the problem would have occurred if the cause had not been present. If not, root cause. If it is, probably a contributing cause. So to have confidence in terms of what a root cause is, we have to ensure our explanations are facts and evidence. They're based on facts and evidence, not conjecture. So to that end, once potential root causes are identified, your teams could verify them with data. For example, if your dual credit attainment by CTE concentrators is declining over time, you could probably have a lot of different speculations. One could be that students are choosing not to participate in credit granting programming. If so, your team should identify supporting data for this contention. For example, look at the number of students achieving concentrator status in programs offering dual credit. If the assumptions are supported, explanation remains. If not, you or your team should consider other potential causes. For example, because some classes are no longer being offered. You repeat this process as many times as necessary to identify a strong set of potential factors. So if you advance the slide. Why conduct a root cause analysis? Well, we do root cause analysis in CTE to address underlying causes of problematic program outcomes. For example, one can conduct a root cause analysis to assess why certain student demographic groups participate in CTE learning areas, such as STEM, at higher rates than others. A root cause analysis could also explore why some groups of students are being retained longer. So in other words, going from participants to concentrators or concentrator plus than other students. And after using the dashboard that we just played with, and hopefully now we all know what we're gonna do over the weekend, a deeper dive could include examining students' course taking patterns, timing of when they enter CTE, or how they're recruited into CTE programs. All of these are things you would do as part of a root cause analysis. So drilling down. If you and your team, you're going to be doing a root cause analysis, it's helpful to think of this as a drill down process. You identify potential root causes, then drill down, taking the steps depicted in this graphic. The process, if you've done it well, will keep you from guessing at causes. We started this drill down process in today's initial training, and the dark boxes sort of emphasize that, but we're going to be providing training on the other steps, the light boxes, and actually digging much deeper into the root cause analysis itself in the next two trainings. But in terms of this drilling down, the first steps entails identifying and prioritizing your gaps. For example, based on a review of Oregon's data on gender, we can already see that females are less likely to engage and persist in CTE programming generally and in different CTE programs. Prioritizing the gap will help you identify where you want to start. One has to identify a gap and then conduct the analysis. This entails identifying a range of causes, and then once your causes are identified, verifying those data using multiple data sources. After reviewing your findings, it's important to determine whether they got a root or a contributing cause. If it's not a root cause, then review your other causes. If it is a root cause, that's where we get into the action plan and the the operational plan on how to address that. So let's talk a little bit about a helpful tool that I like when doing a root cause. The fish. So one helpful tool for conducting a root cause analysis is a fishbone diagram. It's so called because the causes you identify can be grouped into themes. Shown here is issue boxes, and the individual causes are depicted on ribs of the fish. And you can have as many ribs as you'd like. The example here illustrates how a fishbone example might be conducted using 4 themes that we chose: students, teachers, schools, and society. We would put our problem statement at the head of the fish. So here, for example, female students are less likely than male students to achieve CTE concentrator status in STEM programming. So what we do with a root cause analysis, we begin with identifying a priority gap. Here, it's that focus on female students being less likely than males to achieve concentrator status. The analysis that we do requires brainstorming causes that may help to address your problem statement. In the process, you may identify a multitude of causes. Don't actually hold back. In this example, we identified 3: that females may be lacking math prerequisites, that they don't believe they can succeed, or maybe there's some sort of peer effect here and their friends are not enrolling, and so they choose not to also. Once you've identified the brainstorming process, you can prioritize the causes and begin investigating. You use this information to help you select an intervention strategy that you'll use to address your identified challenge. This is actually, for me, the most fun because you get to sit down with your team and you've got a problem and you brainstorm and you just throw everything on the fish bones. And then you go into the process of starting to go a little deeper. When you've completed a root cause analysis, what you'll find, and on the next slide, you'll see, you've identified a range of possible causes. So here, for example, in our theme areas, it could be that not only is the problem related to students, but maybe there's some societal issues at play here. And so if I were brainstorming with my team, I might come up with the parents are not being supportive, or there's something about cultural norms, or employers are biased against females, and so that's why they're not enrolling. So your next step after you've identified all of these ideas is to identify which are root causes and which may be contributing causes. So determining whether an issue is a root cause or contributing cause requires research, right? That's our favorite thing. This includes reviewing existing data and examining the literature to assess the work that's been done to date to determine whether causes are root or contributing. So that dashboard is really helpful in identifying some of those challenges, those gaps, but then you have to take those data and do something with them. When you do start to hit the literature, the team should be making note of evidence-based interventions that may be applied, which will come later in the inquiry cycle in your action planning. So as an example, what we're talking about when we're talking about evidence-based strategies, here's an example I came up with. If I believe that girls are not believing they can succeed in STEM, maybe that's part of the challenge here. So I did a little bit of a literature search. The nice thing about the internet is you always find something. And what we came up with here was one example of a study called Why So Few by report by American Association of University Women. And it looked at STEM programming and the factors that influence women's engagement. And in it, they came up with evidence-based strategies to strengthen female engagement. So if you've gone through your root cause analysis, you identify what you think is a root cause, you test that, and then you go and begin to look at the literature, find evidence-based approaches, and then of course, once you have those, then you move into how do you implement those and then assess for your success. And that will be what we will talk about, that process of how do you conduct that root cause analysis and how do you then operationalize an approach to solve your problem. With that, I will turn it back to Amy.
Thanks, Steve. So we are bumping up on 10:30 here, and we recognize that some of you all have to drop off at that point. So we just kind of want to thank everyone for attending today. For those of you who are able to stay for the next 30 minutes, we will have some time you'll have some time to work again with your own data to do a little bit more playing on the dashboard with the support of a facilitator if needed. For those of you who are leaving, I just want to thank you all for your engagement and participation. We had some really good talks, I think, in the breakout session so far. I will flag, so this is a training series. There are 3 total. The second one, we do not have a date for it scheduled yet, but we are looking at April for the second training. And that will be more focused on what Steve just gave you, kind of that high level preview of conducting a root cause analysis. And so for that training in April, we would be looking for you all to return with a team. Okay, so with your team to kind of work through that root cause analysis as well. And then later on down the road, that third training will be following on thinking about your operational plan. And then also how some of this information from the dashboard could be used in your next round of your CLNA, your comprehensive local needs assessment. So thank you.